The flames ate the Holloway ranch house from the inside out. Orange light spilled through broken windows like blood from a wound. Black smoke climbed into the Wyoming night sky, blotting out stars that had watched over Thunder Ridge for 1,000 years before men came looking for gold. Grace Holloway ran. Her boots pounded dry earth. Her lungs burned with smoke and fear. Behind her, the house she had grown up in collapsed into itself with a sound like the world breaking. Timbers that her grandfather had cut and her father had neglected gave way to fire that cared nothing for history or sentiment. 23 years of life reduced to ash in 23 minutes. She dragged her sister Ruby by the wrist. The girl stumbled, coughing tears, cutting tracks through the soot on her young face. Ruby was 19 and still believed their father was worth saving. Grace had stopped believing that when she was 9 years old, the night her mother died in flames just like these. "Papa's still inside," Ruby screamed, trying to pull away. Grace's grip tightened. Her scarred face, half covered in twisted skin from that fire 14 years ago, caught the hellish light. The burn that ran from her left temple down to her jawline seemed to glow in the darkness. Some in town called it the devil's mark. Others called it God's punishment. Grace called it survival. His debts brought them here. Run, the truth cut through smoke and denial both. Run, behind them came the thunder of hooves. 6 riders, maybe 7, hard men on hard horses carrying torches like ancient conquerors. The lead rider fired a shotgun into the air. The blast split the night. "Drummond says you got 3 days to clear out Holloway." The voice belonged to Hack Wilson, Clayton Drummond's chief enforcer, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and cruelty in equal measure. This is day 4. Grace and Ruby reached the tree line. Grace shoved her sister behind a cottonwood and turned back to watch her childhood burn. The orange glow reflected in her eyes. One eye normal brown, the other pulled slightly downward by scar tissue, giving her face an asymmetry that made strangers look away. She did not look away. She watched every beam fall, every wall collapse, every memory turn to smoke. This was not the first fire Grace Holloway had survived, but she swore to herself, to her mother's ghost, to whatever God still listened to scarred girls in the Wyoming night, that it would be the last fire that took anything from her she was not willing to give. The riders circled the burning house like vultures around a carcass. Hack Wilson sat tall in his saddle, satisfaction written across his brutal features. He did not see Grace watching from the shadows. Men like Wilson never saw women like Grace at all. That would be his mistake. 3 days earlier, the world had not yet burned. 3 days earlier, Grace Holloway stood in the cattle auction yard in Thunder Ridge and learned that her father had found a new way to fail her. The July sun beat down on the packed earth like a hammer on an anvil. Cattle lowed in their pens. Men in dusty clothes and dustier morals gathered to buy and sell flesh that would become beef on tables in cities back east. The smell of manure and sweat and commerce hung heavy in the still air. Frank Holloway stood beside his eldest daughter with his hand wrapped around her wrist. Not gentle, not protective. The grip of a man holding something he intended to sell. Grace knew that grip. She had felt it before when she was small and tried to run from his temper. Before the fire, before her mother's death, before she learned that running only made the pain last longer. "Stand up straight," Frank hissed. His breath carried the sour stink of whiskey consumed at dawn and regret accumulated over decades. "Don't you dare embarrass me." Grace stood straight. She had learned obedience the way all daughters of violent men learn it, through necessity and survival and the small dignity of choosing when to bend rather than being broken. The townspeople of Thunder Ridge watched from the edges of the yard. Proper women in proper dresses whispered behind proper fans. Their eyes found Grace's scar and skittered away like startled birds. Children pointed until their mothers slapped their hands down. Men looked and decided she was not worth looking at twice. Scarred Gracie, they called her, the burned girl, the Holloway shame. Grace had heard every name. She wore them like armor now. Frank leaned close, his grip tightening until Grace felt bones grind. "Drummond said he'll forgive the debt if I give you to his mining camp. Cook and clean for the men. Decent work for a girl with your face." The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples of understanding spread through Grace's mind, each one more horrifying than the last. Her father was not asking. He was informing. The decision had already been made. She was the currency in a transaction she had no part in negotiating. "You're selling me," Grace said. Her voice came out flat. Dead. All the years of hoping her father might love her more than he loved cards and whiskey died in that moment. Grief, it turned out, had a sound. It sounded like nothing at all. "I'm saving us," Frank's voice rose defensive and desperate. "Ruby needs a roof. You." He gestured at her face with his free hand, cruel and casual. "You got no prospects anyway. No man's gonna want damaged goods." The words were designed to wound. They succeeded. But Grace had been wounded before. She knew how to keep standing when everything inside wanted to fall. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to rage, to do something, anything that might change what was already in motion. That was when Josiah Joe Brennan stepped forward. Joe had been standing at the edge of the crowd watching the cattle with the detached interest of a man who came to town 3 times a year and regretted it every time. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from splitting wood and hauling water, and living a life where softness meant death. His face was weathered like old leather, creased at the eyes from years of squinting at mountain distances. Dark hair shot through with early gray. Hazel eyes that had seen things most men only had nightmares about. He wore simple clothes, a wool shirt worn but clean, canvas pants, boots that had walked 1,000 miles and would walk 1,000 more. Everything about him said he did not belong in civilization. He was a mountain compressed into the shape of a man temporarily visiting the flatlands. Joe had watched Frank Holloway drag his daughter through the crowd, had seen the girl's face scarred and stoic, had seen the grip on her wrist possessive and cruel, had seen in her eyes the look he had seen in a Cheyenne girl's eyes 15 years ago in Dakota Territory when soldiers traded her like livestock. Back then, Joe had been young, 21 and fresh from medical training, assigned to the 7th Cavalry as a field medic. He had watched that trade happen and told himself it was not his business. He was a healer, not a crusader. His job was to patch bullet holes and set broken bones, not to question the moral architecture of empire. He had ridden away the next morning, left that girl to whatever fate awaited her in the hands of men who saw her as property. For 15 years, Joe had lived with that choice. It sat in his chest like a stone. Some nights, lying on his porch under stars that witnessed everything and judged nothing, he could still see her face, could still hear the silence of his own cowardice. Not this time. "How much to buy her free?" Joe's voice cut through the auction yard chatter like an axe through kindling. The crowd fell silent. Frank Holloway turned confusion and calculation warring on his face. Grace looked up at the stranger with eyes that expected nothing good from men she did not know. "What?" Frank said. "You heard me." Joe stepped closer. His movements were economical, controlled. A man who never wasted motion, because in the mountains wasted motion could mean death. "How much to clear your debt and let her walk away?" Frank's eyes narrowed. He was a gambling man. He recognized when cards were being dealt that he did not fully understand. But desperation makes men stupid, and Frank Holloway was deeply desperate. $300, he said. It was a fortune, more than most men in Thunder Ridge saw in 2 years of honest work. Frank did not expect the mountain man to have it. This was theater, a way to make himself look less like a man selling his daughter and more like a man forced by circumstance into hard choices. Joe reached into his coat, pulled out a leather wallet worn soft with age, counted bills slowly, deliberately, placed them in Frank's outstretched hand, one at a time. Each bill a small act of rebellion against the world as it was. $300. Then one more, 50. Extra 50, Joe said, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence to never speak to her again. Grace stared at the money, then at the man. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. Men did not spend $350 for nothing. This was not rescue. This was a different kind of transaction, a different master, a different cage. But maybe a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, a cage with a door. Frank took the money. His hand trembled slightly as he counted it. $350 would not clear all his debts, but it would buy time. Time to gamble more, time to drink more, time to tell himself that what he had just done was necessary rather than unforgivable. He released Grace's wrist. She stood there free and untethered for the first time in her life, belonging to no one but herself. The feeling lasted exactly 4 seconds. Why? She asked, looking up at Josiah Brennan. Joe met her eyes, held her gaze, did not flinch from the scar, did not look away from the question behind the question. Because 15 years ago, he said, I watched a Cheyenne girl get sold the same way. I was a soldier then. Told myself it wasn't my fight. He paused. The auction yard waited. I was wrong. Before Grace could respond, before she could parse whether this was redemption or replacement, the sound of approaching horses cut through the moment like a knife through skin. 7 riders entered the yard. At their head rode Owen Drummond, 28 years old, and already carrying the weight of his father's expectations like a millstone around his neck. He was handsome in the way that wealth often makes men handsome, well-groomed, well-dressed, a face that had never known hunger or hard labor. But his eyes held something that money could not buy or breeding erase. Fear. Fear of his father. Fear of failure. Fear that no matter what he did, he would never be enough. Owen reined his horse to a stop in front of Frank Holloway. Ignored Joe completely. Men like Owen had been raised to believe that mountain men were beneath notice, part of the landscape rather than part of civilization. Papa sent me to collect the girl, Owen said. His voice was smooth educated, the product of Eastern schools and Western ambition. Frank, you were supposed to deliver her to the camp. Frank stammered. The money in his hand suddenly felt like evidence of betrayal. I got the money now. The debt's cleared. Owen's eyes flicked to the bills, then to Joe. His expression shifted from dismissive to calculating. Here was a variable his father had not accounted for. Here was a problem. You just bought yourself trouble, mountain man. Owen's hand rested casually on the pistol at his hip. Not a threat, just a reminder that violence was always an option. That girl belongs to Drummond Holdings now. Joe's posture did not change. He did not reach for the rifle on his back or the knife at his belt. He simply stood solid as granite and spoke with the calm certainty of a man who had been shot at by better marksmen than Owen Drummond would ever be. She belongs to herself. I paid her father's debt. Transaction's done. The air in the auction yard grew thick with tension. Men who had been watching cattle now watched the confrontation with the hungry attention of those who suspect violence is coming and want to be able to say they saw it happen. Owen's jaw tightened. He was not his father. Clayton Drummond would have already drawn and fired, consequences be damned. But Owen had been raised in the long shadow of a violent man, and he had learned that sometimes the threat of violence worked better than violence itself. My father don't see it that way. Grace stepped between them. The movement surprised everyone, including Grace herself. But something had shifted in the last 5 minutes. Something fundamental about who she was and what she would accept. She had spent 23 years being told she was worthless, being treated as an object to be hidden or traded or used. She was done. Nobody owns me, Grace said. Her voice was steady despite the fear running through her veins like ice water. Not my father, not your father, not him. She gestured toward Joe without looking at him. Nobody. Owen stared at her, at the scar that marked her face, at the defiance in her stance. Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. He saw in her the same thing he saw in himself when he looked in mirrors late at night. The desperate need to be more than what others had decided they were. "We'll see about that scarred Gracie." The nickname was meant to wound. It landed differently than Owen expected. Grace did not flinch. Owen leaned forward in his saddle, dropped his voice so only Grace, Joe, and Frank could hear. "Papa controls the water rights to Thunder Ridge, every mine, every ranch. You cross him, you die of thirst." The threat delivered. Owen wheeled his horse, made eye contact with Hack Wilson, his father's enforcer, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. "Follow them," Owen said quietly. "Find out where the mountain man lives. Papa will want to know." The riders left the way they had come. Dust and menace in equal measure. Grace stood in the settling dust and felt the weight of what had just happened. She had been sold, then bought, then threatened. All in the span of 10 minutes. Her life, which had been small and sad, and at least predictable, had just become dangerous in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Joe touched her elbow gently. "Come with me." Grace looked back at her father. Frank would not meet her eyes. He clutched his $350, and already his mind was calculating which saloon would take his money and which card game would take it from him. "Pop," Grace said, "one last try. One last hope that the man who had raised her might say something, anything, that proved he had loved her even a little." Frank turned his back. Grace followed Josiah Brennan out of the auction yard, out of the only life she had ever known, toward a future that was terrifying precisely because it was unknown. Ruby watched from the general store porch, too young to understand everything that had just happened, old enough to know that her sister had just walked away and might never come back. The ride up to Joe's cabin took 4 hours. They traveled in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves on stone and the cry of hawks circling overhead. The trail climbed steadily, leaving behind the valley floor and the town and the world of men who bought and sold and burned. Grace rode behind Joe on a spare horse he kept for hauling supplies. She watched his back, rigid and alert, scanning the trail ahead and the tree line on either side. This was a man who expected trouble the way most men expected sunrise, inevitable and requiring preparation. She should have been afraid, probably, but fear had been her constant companion for so long that it felt more like an old friend than a warning. And beneath the fear ran something else, something new and fragile and dangerous. Hope. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a valley so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still holding snow, even in July. A creek ran clear and cold 30 yards from the cabin, fed by springs higher up. Pine trees provided shade. Wildflowers grew in patches of sunlight. The air smelled clean in a way that Grace had forgotten air could smell. The cabin itself was solid. Hand-cut logs chinked tight against winter wind. A porch with 2 chairs. Windows with real glass, not just hide stretched over frames. A vegetable garden struggling in the summer heat, but still alive. A corral with 2 horses and a mule. A smokehouse. A woodshed stacked with enough fuel to last through winters that could kill the unprepared. This was not the shack of a hermit hiding from the world. This was a home built by a man who knew how to make things that lasted. Joe dismounted and helped Grace down. His hands were gentle but impersonal, the touch of a medic handling a patient, not a man handling property. "Water's in the barrel by the door," Joe said, pointing. "Privy's out back. Bed inside is yours. I'll sleep on the porch." Grace stared at him. "What do you want from me?" The question had been building since the auction yard. Every second of silence on the trail up had added weight to it. Men did not spend $350 for nothing. They did not buy women and then offer them beds and privacy. There was always a cost. Always. Joe met her eyes. "Nothing. Men don't pay for nothing. I paid for your freedom. What you do with it is yours." "I don't trust you." Joe nodded slowly as if she had said something wise rather than insulting. Good. Trust is earned. I haven't earned yours yet. He pointed down the mountain trail. Trail's right there. Goes both ways. You want to leave, leave. I won't stop you. Won't follow you. You're free. Grace looked down the trail, then back at the cabin. At the garden that needed weeding. At the porch with 2 chairs as if he had been expecting company. At the man who claimed he wanted nothing. Drummond's men followed us, she said. I saw them. They're camped about a mile down. I know. They'll come in the morning. Probably. What will you do? Joe picked up a rifle that had been leaning against the porch rail, started checking it with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom weapons were tools necessary and unremarkable. Depends on what they want. If they want to talk, we'll talk. If they want trouble. He looked at her, and for the first time Grace saw in his eyes the soldier he used to be. I've handled trouble before. He handed her a second rifle, older but well-maintained. You should know how to use this. Grace took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected. The weight of it felt like responsibility, like power. Why? She asked again, the question that kept recurring because the answer kept not making sense. Because Drummond's men followed us here, Joe said simply, and I'd rather you could defend yourself than hope I'm fast enough to defend you. That night Grace did not sleep. She lay on a real bed with a real pillow for the first time in months. Since her father had sold her bed frame to pay a poker debt, and she had been sleeping on a pile of blankets in the corner of a room that smelled like failure and whiskey. The cabin was quiet. Outside she could hear the creek running, an owl calling, the wind moving through the pines, and beneath it all the sound of Josiah Brennan not sleeping either. The creak of the porch boards as he shifted position, the click of metal on metal as he checked his rifle for the 3rd time. A man preparing for morning. Grace got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, stepped out onto the porch. Joe sat in one of the chairs, rifle across his knees, looking out at the darkness. He did not turn when she approached. Can't sleep, he asked. You said you were a soldier. Which war? Indian Wars. Dakota Territory 76 to 78. Field medic with the 7th Cavalry. Grace knew enough history to know what that meant. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit, the one that had been decimated at Little Bighorn and rebuilt with men who had to carry the weight of that defeat. Why'd you leave? Joe was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief worn smooth by time, but never truly fading. Saw too many good people die for bad reasons. Decided if I was going to watch people suffer, I'd at least try to help them rather than just patch them up so they could go suffer some more. Is that why you helped me? You felt sorry for me? No. The answer was immediate and firm. I felt sorry for myself. 15 years of living with the fact that I let something wrong happen because it was easier than stopping it. You were my chance to not be that person anymore. Grace pulled the blanket tighter. What happened to your face? The question surprised her as much as it surprised him. But he had asked her directly about her scar. Turnabout seemed fair. Joe's hand went unconsciously to his jaw where a thin white line ran from his ear to his chin, barely visible in the darkness, but there. Knife fight in Montana, 79. Man drew on me in a card game. He was faster with the blade. I was luckier with where I got cut. You killed him. Yes, no apology in his voice, no pride either, just fact. Grace sat down in the other chair. I need to tell you something. Joe waited. My face. Everyone thinks it was a barn fire, an accident when I was 9. But it wasn't. No. The word came out small, ashamed. My father came home drunk. My mother tried to stop him from hitting me. He threw a lamp. The oil spilled. The curtains caught. The whole house went up. She paused, breathed, continued. My mother got me out, went back for my father. He was passed out. By the time she dragged him out, the fire had. It took her 3 days to die. The whole time my father told everyone it was an accident, that I knocked over the lamp playing, and I let him. Because I was 9 and scared, and I thought maybe if I just stayed quiet he'd love me again, the way he used to before the drinking." Joe said nothing, just listened. "He never did," Grace finished. "Love me again, and I stayed quiet for 14 years. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of understanding, of recognition between two people who had both learned that sometimes the worst wounds were the ones that did not show. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Joe said finally. "Are you sorry you bought me? No. Even knowing that my face." Joe turned to look at her directly. His eyes were clear in the starlight. "Grace, your face tells me you survived something that should have killed you. That's not a flaw. That's proof you're stronger than fire." Something in Grace's chest cracked. Not broke. Cracked open. Like ice on a river in spring, letting something frozen begin to flow again. She started to cry. Silent tears that ran down both sides of her face, the scarred and the unscarred. She put her hand over her mouth to keep from making sound. Spent 23 years learning to cry quietly so her father would not hear and get angry at her weakness. Joe reached over and gently pulled her hand away from her mouth. "You don't have to be quiet here," he said. Grace sobbed, once, twice, then gulped air and forced herself back to stillness. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Not yet. Not until she knew she was truly safe. "Thank you," she said when she could speak again, "for the coffee earlier, and for this, letting me stay." "You're welcome." They sat in silence, not awkward, not empty. The silence of two people who had both been alone for so long that shared quiet felt like company. Grace stood. "I should try to sleep." "Grace," she turned back. "Tomorrow or the next day Drummond's men are going to come up here. When they do, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll do exactly what I say when I say it, without argument. Not because I own you, because I've been in firefights and you haven't, and I'd like us both to live through this." Grace nodded. "I promise." "Good. Now get some rest. You're going to need it." Grace went inside, lay down on the bed, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 14 years she fell asleep without her hand pressed over her scar, hiding it from the world, even in darkness. Outside, Joe Brennan sat watch until dawn, rifle across his knees, waiting for trouble he knew was coming. Morning came to the ridge with the kind of quiet that made men nervous. No birds sang. The wind held its breath. Even the creek seemed to run softer, as if the water itself sensed that something was about to break. Joe had been right about Drummond's men. They came at dawn. Grace woke to the sound of horses and voices. She grabbed the rifle Joe had given her the night before and moved to the window. Through the thin curtain she could see 4 riders stopped at the edge of the clearing, not advancing, not retreating, just sitting their horses and watching the cabin like wolves watching a den. Joe stood on the porch, his own rifle held casual but ready, the posture of a man who had done this before. The casual readiness of someone for whom violence was not shocking, but simply one of many tools in the box. "You boys lost?" Joe called out. His voice carried across the clearing without strain, a voice used to giving orders across battlefields and being heard over gunfire. The lead rider was not Hack Wilson as Grace had expected. It was Owen Drummond himself. He sat his horse well, spine straight, hat shading his eyes, playing at being his father, trying on authority like a coat that did not quite fit. "My father sent me with a message, Brennan," Owen said. "No preamble, no pleasantries. You got 7 days to vacate this land. He's willing to pay $500 for your trouble." "Land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale. It's just a matter of price." Joe shifted his weight slightly. The rifle moved with him, still not aimed but present. Undeniable. "Then we got different philosophies about the world. Mine says some things belong to themselves and can't be bought. Your daddy says everything's got a price tag." Owen's jaw tightened. Grace watched from the window and saw something in his face that surprised her. Not anger, shame. He knew what his father was, knew it and hated it, and served it anyway because the alternative was being cast out into a world where the Drummond name meant nothing. "There's gold under this ridge," Owen said. "Survey confirmed it. My father's buying up every claim in the district. You're the last holdout." "Then I guess I'll keep holding out. He'll cut the water." The threat landed heavy. Joe's expression did not change, but Grace saw his knuckles go white on the rifle stock. "Explain that," Joe said. Owen pointed down the ridge toward the valley below. "Your creek feeds the Thunder Ridge mining camp, 200 miners, their families. The whole operation depends on that water. My father controls the water rights on every other source in the district. You don't sell, he diverts your creek. The camp dries up. The mines close. 200 people lose their livelihood." He paused. Let the weight of it settle. "Because of your pride." Grace stepped onto the porch. The movement drew every eye. The morning sun caught her scar, made it stand out stark and pink against her skin. She did not try to hide it, did not turn the scarred side away. She looked Owen Drummond in the eye and spoke with a clarity that surprised her. "This isn't pride. This is principle. Your father's trying to force a good man off land that's legally his, using innocent people as leverage, and you're here delivering that message like you don't know how wrong it is." Owen stared at her, at the scar, at the defiance. Something shifted in his face. Recognition, maybe, or the first crack in the armor of inherited cruelty. 7 days, he repeated, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. After that, the water stops flowing. The riders left. Grace and Joe stood on the porch and watched them disappear down the trail. The quiet returned, but it felt different now. Loaded, like the moment before a storm breaks. "He's going to do it," Grace said. "Use those miners as a weapon against you." "I know. We have to warn them." Joe nodded slowly. "I know someone down there, Sam Keller, runs the miners' union. If anyone can organize resistance, it's him. Then we go today." "Grace." Joe turned to look at her. "Once we do this, there's no walking it back. Drummond will come at us with everything he has. Legal, illegal, doesn't matter to men like him. You sure you want this fight?" Grace thought about her mother dying in flames while her father told lies. Thought about 23 years of being called Scarred Gracie and worthless and damaged goods. Thought about standing in an auction yard while her own father sold her like livestock. "I've been in a fight my whole life," she said. "Just didn't have anyone standing with me before, so yes, I'm sure." They saddled horses. Joe packed supplies with the efficiency of a man who had traveled light and fast when speed mattered more than comfort. Grace watched and learned how to distribute weight, how to secure a bedroll, how to make sure a rifle stayed accessible but protected. They were halfway down the trail when they heard hoofbeats behind them. Joe's hand went to his rifle. Grace followed his lead. They waited. Ruby Holloway came around the bend on a horse that looked too big for her slight frame. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red from crying. Her dress was torn at the hem. "Gracie." She pulled the horse to a stumbling stop, nearly fell from the saddle. Grace caught her. "Ruby, what happened?" "They burned it." Ruby's voice shook. "Drummond's men. They burned the ranch. Everything. Papa's missing." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her. The ranch. The house where her mother had died, where Grace had spent her childhood. It had not been much. A collection of weathered boards and broken dreams. But it had been hers, in the way that places from childhood are always somehow ours, even when we hate them. "When?" Joe asked. His voice was gentle but urgent. "Last night. I was staying with Mrs. Carpenter in town. When I went back this morning, it was just gone. Ashes." Grace's hands tightened on her sister's arms. "Where's Papa?" "I don't know, Sheriff Garrett said." "Said Drummond filed charges, arson. Claims Papa burned the ranch himself for insurance money." "That's insane," Grace said. "We don't have insurance." "I know, but Sheriff says he has to bring Papa in. Drummond's the magistrate's biggest donor. The law does what he says." Joe and Grace exchanged a look. The situation had just escalated from threat to action. Drummond was not waiting 7 days. He was moving now, burning out anyone who might stand with Joe, manufacturing legal justification for seizing property. "Come with us," Joe said to Ruby. Thunder Ridge Mining Camp. We're going to talk to people who might be willing to fight back." Ruby nodded, wiped her eyes, straightened her spine. She was 19, but in that moment Grace saw something harder emerge. The same steel that lived in Grace. The inheritance of all daughters who learn that no one is coming to save them. The three of them rode down into Thunder Ridge as the sun climbed toward noon. The mining camp sprawled across the valley floor like a wound in the earth. Tents and shacks clustered around the mine entrances. Sluice boxes lined the creek. The sound of hammers on rock echoed off the canyon walls. 200 souls digging wealth from the ground for wages that kept them just this side of starvation. They found Sam Keller at the Union Hall, a converted barn where miners gathered to argue and organize and dream of better wages and safer conditions. Sam was 45, built like a man who had spent his life swinging a pickaxe. Irish immigrant, red hair going gray, eyes that had seen friends die in cave-ins and still showed up to work the next day because rent was due and children needed feeding. "Joe Brennan." Sam stood and shook Joe's hand. "Heard you finally came down from that mountain of yours. Wish it was for better reasons." They talked. Joe explained about Drummond's ultimatum, the threat to cut the water, the 7-day deadline. Sam's face darkened with each detail. "He's been squeezing us for months," Sam said, "buying up claims from desperate men, offering pennies on the dollar and calling it generous. Anyone refuses, suddenly there's a problem with their water rights, or their deed has a flaw, or the bank calls their loan." An old woman emerged from the back of the hall carrying a pot of coffee and tin cups. Ida Carpenter, 68 years old, camp cook and unofficial matriarch. She had survived the Irish famine as a child, crossed an ocean, buried 2 husbands, and raised 4 children in a land that seemed determined to kill everyone who was not rich and white and male. She was tougher than the mountains and twice as permanent. "This about Drummond?" Ida asked, pouring coffee with hands that still moved steady despite the years. "Yes, ma'am," Joe said. "About damn time someone stood up to that bastard, pardon my language." Ida set down the pot and pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. "My son works as a clerk in Drummond's office, copying contracts, filing papers, that sort of thing. He don't like what he sees, but he needs the work. Been sneaking me information." She unfolded the paper. It was a map. The entire Thunder Ridge district with properties marked in different colors. Green for land Drummond already owned. Yellow for land he was negotiating to buy. Red for holdouts. There were 12 red marks. Joe's land was the biggest. "He's not just after gold," Ida said. "He wants to own the whole district. Every mine, every claim, every drop of water. Then he sells it all to the railroad at a profit that'll make him richer than God." Grace studied the map. Her mind, trained by years of reading her father's tells at the card table, saw the pattern. "How many of these yellow properties did he buy in the last month?" 7, Ida said. "And how many of those sellers had debts to him?" Ida's eyes narrowed. "All of them." Grace looked at Joe, at Sam, at her sister. "He's loaning money he knows people can't pay back, then using the debt to force them to sell their land cheap. That's not business. That's extortion." Sam slammed his fist on the table. "I knew it. I goddamn knew it. But knowing and proving are different things." "Then we prove it," Grace said. The words came out before she fully thought them through, but once spoken, they felt right. True. "We find the contracts, we document the pattern, we expose him." "How?" Ruby asked. "By getting inside his office, getting the evidence, and making it public in a way he can't suppress." Over the next hour a plan took shape. Not a good plan, not a safe plan, but a plan nonetheless. Ida's son would help get them access to Drummond's office when the building was empty. They would photograph the contracts that showed the predatory lending. Grace would interview families who had been forced to sell, get their testimonies on record. Sam would organize the miners to stand witness when they went public. But they needed more than just evidence. They needed allies with authority, legal standing, moral weight. That was when Reverend Augustus Cole walked into the Union Hall. Cole was 55, black as midnight, and possessed of a voice that could fill a church or a canyon with equal ease. He had been born into slavery in Mississippi, freed by Union soldiers during the war, taught to read by a Quaker missionary, and ordained in a tradition that believed the gospel was about justice here on earth, not just salvation in the hereafter. His church served the black miners and their families, a congregation of 60 souls who worked twice as hard for half the wages and knew that the law would never protect them the way it protected white men. But they had faith, and they had Reverend Cole. "I heard you're organizing against Drummond," Cole said, without preamble. "I want in." "It's dangerous," Joe warned. "Brother, I was born dangerous to men like Drummond. The day I learned to read was the day I became a threat to their whole system. They've been trying to put me back in my place for 50 years. Haven't managed yet." Cole sat down at the table. "What do you need?" "Witnesses," Grace said. "People willing to testify about what Drummond's done. And someone with moral authority to document it, make it official. I can do that. And I can offer the church as sanctuary. He comes after any of you. You've got a place the law will think twice about raiding." The alliance grew. 6 people around a table. A mountain man, 2 scarred sisters, a union organizer, a cook, a preacher, against a man who owned the law and the land and the water that sustained life in the desert. But they had something Drummond did not have. They had nothing left to lose. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of shouting outside. Sam jumped to his feet. The others followed. Outside the Union Hall, miners were gathering near the creek, pointing, yelling. Grace pushed through the crowd and saw what had them agitated. The creek was rising, fast. Water that should have been running clear and controlled was churning brown with mud and debris. The level climbed the banks. Sluice boxes that had been carefully positioned started to tip and tumble. Tents, pitched near the water's edge, flooded. "The dam," someone shouted. "Something's wrong with the dam." Joe was already running. Grace followed. They raced upstream past the mining operations, past the camp, toward the source of the water. The dam was not large, just a simple structure of logs and stones that Joe had built years ago to control the creek's flow. It regulated how much water went to his land and how much continued down to the mining camp. A balance. A system that had worked for 8 years without problem. Now it was destroyed. Someone had used dynamite. The logs were splintered. The stones scattered. Water poured through the breach in an uncontrolled rush, flooding the valley below and leaving Joe's irrigation channels dry as bone. And carved into a tree beside the ruined dam, fresh and deliberate, were words cut deep into the bark: 7 days. Grace stood beside Joe and watched 8 years of careful water management wash away in minutes. Watched the mining camp below start to flood. Watched the future Drummond had promised arrive ahead of schedule. "He's not waiting," Joe said quietly. His voice was calm, but his hands were fists. "He's making his move now. Can we rebuild it? Not before the camp floods, and even if we could, he'd just destroy it again." Sam arrived breathing hard from the run uphill. He took in the destruction with a single sweeping glance, and his face went hard as flint. "That son of a bitch. He's trying to make it look like you're the problem, like your dam failed and caused the flood." "Will it work?" Grace asked. "With the law in his pocket, yeah, it'll work. He'll sue you for damages. When you can't pay, he'll take the land." Joe stared at the ruined dam, at the water running wild, at the future closing in like walls of a cell. "How long?" he asked. "How long what?" "How long until the camp is uninhabitable from the flood?" Sam calculated. "Water's rising fast. By nightfall, half the tents will be underwater. By tomorrow morning, people will start leaving. Within a week, the whole operation shuts down. And then Drummond buys it all. For nothing, yeah." Grace felt rage building in her chest, hot and bright and demanding action. This was not about land anymore, not about water rights or gold claims. This was about a bully using his power to destroy people who could not fight back, using their desperation against them. using their need for water and wages and survival as weapons. She had lived under a bully's thumb her whole life. She was done. "We go tonight," Grace said. The decision made itself. "We get into Drummond's office tonight, and we take everything. Every contract, every ledger, every piece of paper that proves what he's doing. And tomorrow, we make it public." "Grace," Joe started. "No." She turned to face him. "You said I was free. You said I could choose. This is me choosing. We hit him now while he thinks he's winning, while he's not expecting it." Sam grinned. It was not a nice grin. It was the grin of a man who had been taking punches his whole life and finally saw a chance to punch back. "I like her," Sam said to Joe. "She's got spine." "She's going to get herself killed," Joe said. But there was no heat in it, just resignation. He knew Grace was right. Waiting meant losing. Action, even dangerous action, was their only play. "Then we better make sure she doesn't," Sam said. "Ida's boy can get us in. The building's empty after 6. We go in fast, grab what we can get out before anyone notices." "And if someone does notice," Ruby asked, "then we run, and we hope Joe's as good a shot as people say." They spent the afternoon planning. Ida's son, a nervous young man named Daniel, drew them a map of Drummond's office, showed them where the safe was, where the contracts were filed, which window had a broken lock that no one had bothered to fix. Grace listened and memorized. She had spent years watching her father cheat at cards, had learned how to track information, spot patterns, remember details. Those skills learned in smoky saloons while pretending not to notice were about to become weapons. As the sun started to sink toward the mountains, Ruby pulled Grace aside. "I need to tell you something," Ruby said. Her voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "What? I talked to Owen Drummond in town a few times." Grace felt her stomach drop. "Ruby." I know it's stupid, but he's not like his father Gracie. He's trapped, just like we were with Papa. He hates what his father makes him do, but he doesn't know how to break free. He burned our house." "His father did." "Owen wasn't there. I asked him." Grace wanted to yell, to rage at her sister's naivete, to shake some sense into her. But Ruby's eyes held something Grace recognized, the desperate hope that anyone might be better than they seemed. Grace had carried that hope about their father for years. It had never paid off, but she understood it. What did he say when you talked to him? That he was sorry, that he wished things were different, that he— Ruby looked down at her hands. "That he thought I deserved better than what his father wanted to make me, which was what? A saloon girl. That was the deal his father made with Papa, my debt for working there. Owen said his father was going to force me into. She could not finish the sentence. Grace pulled her sister into a hug, felt Ruby shake with silent tears. "He told me," Ruby whispered against Grace's shoulder. "He warned me to run. That's why I went to Mrs. Carpenter's. Owen sent a note saying to get out of the house. I didn't know Papa owed so much. Didn't know Drummond was going to burn it. But Owen knew something bad was coming." Grace absorbed this. Tried to reconcile it with the young man who had ridden up to Joe's cabin with threats. Maybe people were more complicated than she wanted them to be. Maybe Owen Drummond was both his father's son and his own person trapped between legacy and conscience. "Do you trust him?" Grace asked. "I don't know, but I think he wants to help, if we give him the chance." Grace pulled back, looked her sister in the eye. "If you're wrong, if he betrays us, then I'll be the one who pays for it, not you." Before Grace could respond, Joe appeared. "It's time," he said. The sun was setting as they rode toward Thunder Ridge. Grace, Joe, Sam, and Daniel. Ruby stayed behind with Ida at the church despite her protests. This was the dangerous part, the part where people could get shot or arrested or both. The town was quiet in the way frontier towns got quiet at dusk, working men heading home, saloons starting to fill, shops closing. The respectable people retreating indoors while the less respectable came out to play. Drummond's office was above the general store on Main Street, a prime location, a statement about status and power. The building was dark. Daniel had been right. Drummond did his business during the day and his drinking at night. Predictable, arrogant, convinced that no one would dare move against him. They tied their horses 2 streets over, approached on foot. Daniel led them to the back of the building, to the window he had promised would be unlocked. It was. Grace went in first. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She had broken into her father's desk 100 times, looking for money he had promised for food or medicine. This was the same, just higher stakes. The office was neat, organized, files in alphabetical order. A safe in the corner closed, but Daniel had brought the combination. His father kept it written on a card in his desk drawer at home. Trusting, stupid. Grace opened the safe while Joe stood watch at the door. Inside were contracts, dozens of them. She grabbed them all, did not stop to read, just took everything and stuffed it into the canvas bag they had brought. She was halfway through the filing cabinet when she heard footsteps on the stairs outside. Joe's hand went to his gun. Sam moved to the window. Daniel froze, panic written across his young face. The door opened. Hack Wilson stood in the doorway. Drummond's enforcer, 6 feet of muscle and meanness. His hand was already on his pistol. "Well, well," Hack said. His voice was like gravel rolling downhill. "The scarred girl's a thief now." Grace's hand found the small revolver Joe had insisted she carry. She drew it, pointed it at Hack with hands that shook but did not waver. "I'm taking what's ours," she said. Hack laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You ain't going to shoot me? You're a cook, not a killer." Grace's finger moved to the trigger. Every instinct screamed at her to fire, to protect herself, to fight back against men who thought women like her were too weak or too scared or too damaged to be dangerous. But Joe's voice cut through the moment. "Grace, don't." She looked at him. His eyes said what his words did not. Killing Hack would make them murderers, would give Drummond exactly what he needed to destroy them legally. Grace adjusted her aim, fired. The bullet went into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the small room. Plaster rained down. Hack flinched back, surprised. Grace grabbed the bag of contracts and ran, out the door, down the stairs. Hack's shouting behind them, the sound of more footsteps, more voices. Drummond's men responding to the gunshot. They hit the street running. Joe fired twice over his shoulder, not aiming to kill, but to slow pursuit. The reports echoed off false-fronted buildings. Windows lit up as people looked out to see what the commotion was about. Their horses were where they left them. Grace threw herself into the saddle. The bag of contracts clutched to her chest like a child, like something precious and fragile that she would die before letting go. They rode hard out of town. Behind them, more shots. The sound of horses being saddled. Pursuit organizing. They did not slow until they reached the church. Reverend Cole was waiting with the doors open. They rode straight in. Cole shut the doors behind them and dropped the bar. "They'll come," Joe said, breathing hard. "Let them," Cole replied. "This is consecrated ground. They want to drag you out, they'll have to answer for it. To God and to the community." Grace dismounted. Her legs nearly gave out. Adrenaline and fear caught up with her all at once. She leaned against her horse and tried to remember how to breathe. Ruby appeared with water, Ida with whiskey, Sam with a grim smile. "You did it," Sam said. "You actually did it." Grace looked at the bag of contracts, at the evidence that would either save them or condemn them. "Now what?" Now Reverend Cole said, "We see what the good Lord's opinion is on men who build empires on other people's suffering." Outside they could hear horses, voices. Hack Wilson shouting about thieves and law and consequences. Inside the church, 6 people who had nothing and everything to lose sat in candlelight and counted contracts that added up to a crime too big to hide and a man too powerful to ignore. The reckoning was coming. They were ready. They spent the night in Reverend Cole's church going through contracts by candlelight, 47 documents. Each one a small tragedy written in legal language and sealed with desperate signatures. Grace read while the others organized. Her eyes tracked lines of text that all said the same thing in different words. Loans at 40% interest compounded monthly. Payment terms designed to be impossible to meet. Clauses buried in fine print that gave Drummond the right to seize property at his discretion. Contracts that were not agreements but traps built from paper and ink and the desperation of people who had no other options. "This one's the Garza family," Grace said, holding up a contract. 8 children, borrowed $75 to pay for medicine when their youngest got sick. Terms say they owe $600 within 6 months or forfeit their land claim. Ida looked up from the ledger she was reviewing. "I know Maria Garza, good woman. Her husband works double shifts in the mine trying to pay that back. It's killing him, literally. Man's coughing up blood, but he keeps working because what else can he do?" Sam marked another contract. "Patterson Ranch, Reynolds Homestead, the Mueller family. All the same pattern. All loans they couldn't possibly repay." But it was the ledger that told the complete story. Not just the contracts, but the payments. The record of who had paid what and when. And more importantly, what happened when they could not pay. Property seized, sold at auction, to buyers who were, according to the neat handwriting in the ledger, all shell companies owned by Clayton Drummond himself. He loaned money. People defaulted. He took their land, then sold it back to himself for pennies on the dollar to establish legal ownership. It was fraud, clear and documented. The kind of crime that even bought judges would have trouble ignoring if it was made public enough. "How do we make it public?" Daniel asked. He had been quiet since the escape from Drummond's office, processing the fact that he had just committed a crime against the most powerful man in the territory. "I mean, we have the evidence, but who's going to listen? Drummond owns the magistrate. The sheriff's scared of him. The newspaper won't print anything against him." "Then we go over their heads," Grace said. An idea was forming. Risky. Probably stupid, but possible. Drummond's hosting a gala next week. Railroad executives, the territorial governor, all the important people he's trying to impress. What if we make our case there, in front of witnesses he can't threaten or buy? Joe looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. "That's bold. That's suicide," Sam said bluntly. "You walk into Drummond's event and start accusing him, he'll have you thrown out or arrested before you finish a sentence." "Not if we do it right," Grace insisted. "Not if we present evidence they can't ignore. Documents, witnesses, make it too big and too public for him to sweep away." Reverend Cole leaned back in his pew, considering. She's right. Drummond's power comes from operating in the shadows. Dragging him into the light is the only way to beat him. "It's dangerous," Joe said. "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Grace replied. She looked at the contracts spread across the church floor, at the names of families she had never met, but whose suffering she could read in every line of legal text. "We've come this far. We don't stop now." Over the next 6 days they prepared. Grace interviewed families, sat in small shacks and dirt floor homes, and listened to people tell their stories. How Drummond had seemed kind at first, how the loans had seemed reasonable, how the terms had been hidden in language they could not understand, how they had signed because their children were hungry or sick or cold, and what choice did they have? She took notes, memorized names, built a case not from legal theory but from human suffering. Sam organized the miners, quietly, carefully. No big meetings that would draw attention, just conversations over lunch breaks and after-shift drinks, building consensus, making sure that when the moment came they would have numbers on their side. Reverend Cole prepared testimony, documented everything with the precise care of a man who understood that the law might not protect them, but proper documentation might at least make it harder to kill them quietly. Ruby worked with Ida gathering more information. The cook's network of gossips and servants and people who cleaned rich men's offices turned out to be an intelligence operation that would have impressed military strategists. They learned that Governor William Harris would attend Drummond's gala, that he was up for re-election and needed to appear tough on corruption. that he was, according to his own chambermaid, deeply uncomfortable with how much influence men like Drummond had over territorial politics, a pressure point, an opportunity. On the third day, Owen Drummond appeared at the church. He came alone. No guards, no enforcers, just a young man on a horse looking like he had not slept in days. He dismounted and stood at the church door, not entering, waiting to be acknowledged. Ruby saw him first. She stepped outside before anyone could stop her. Grace watched through the window as her sister talked to Owen, saw his hands move, pleading or explaining, saw Ruby's posture soften, then harden, then soften again. When Ruby came back inside, she was holding a rolled paper. "Owen wants to help," she said. Joe stood. His hand moved toward his gun. "That's what he wants you to think." "No." Ruby unrolled the paper. It was a floor plan of Drummond's hotel, the building where the gala would be held. "He drew this, showed me where his father's private office is, where the safe is that holds the original copies of all these contracts. He says if we're going to expose his father, we need both sets, the ones we took and the originals. Otherwise, Drummond will claim we forged everything." "It's a trap," Sam said. "Maybe," Ruby admitted. "But Owen says he's done. Done being his father's weapon. Done pretending he doesn't see what's happening. He wants out, and helping us is his way out." Grace took the floor plan, studied it. "Why should we trust him?" "Because," Ruby said quietly, "he told me where his father keeps the second ledger, the one that shows the bribes, to the magistrate, to the sheriff, to the newspaper editor. Exact amounts and dates. He says that's what will really bring his father down, not the contracts, the corruption." The room went silent. A second ledger, proof not just of fraud, but of the entire system of power that protected it. That was not just evidence. That was dynamite. "Where is it?" Joe asked. "In Drummond's personal safe, in his bedroom at the hotel. Owen has the combination. And he's just going to give it to us." Joe's voice was heavy with skepticism. "He's going to get it himself," Ruby said, "during the gala, while his father's occupied, then pass it to us." Grace looked at her sister, at the hope and fear warring in Ruby's young face, at the terrible vulnerability of trusting someone who might be playing them, or might be genuine. "If he betrays us," Grace said, "people could die." "I know," Ruby met her sister's eyes. "But if he's telling the truth, we win, really win, not just stop Drummond, dismantle the whole system he built." Grace thought about risk and reward, about the fact that every good thing she had ever gained had come from taking chances that terrified her. Leaving the auction yard with Joe, breaking into Drummond's office, standing up instead of staying quiet. "Okay," she said. "We trust him, but we plan for betrayal." The night of the gala arrived with unseasonable rain. Thunder rumbled over the mountains. Lightning split the sky. The kind of weather that made old-timers talk about omens and signs from God. Drummond's hotel blazed with light against the storm, the finest building in Thunder Ridge, 3 stories of imported lumber and Eastern ambition, built to announce that civilization had arrived in the wilderness, and it wore a silk tie. Carriages pulled up to the entrance, men in evening clothes, women in dresses that cost more than miners earned in a year. The territorial elite gathered to celebrate Clayton Drummond's vision for the future, a future where wealth concentrated in the hands of those who already had it, and everyone else worked until they died or moved on. Grace entered through the kitchen door, dressed in a simple black dress borrowed from one of Ida's daughters, hair pulled back, scar visible but not hidden. She carried a tray of champagne glasses like she belonged there, like she was just another servant, invisible to the important people. Joe was positioned across the street, rifle hidden but ready, watching exits, ready to cover their escape if things went bad. Sam and 20 miners waited 2 blocks away, close enough to respond, far enough to not draw attention. Inside the hotel ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast golden light over polished floors. A small orchestra played music that Grace did not recognize. Important people made important conversation about markets and investments and opportunities. Clayton Drummond stood at the center of it all, holding court. He was 52 but looked younger. Money and power had a way of preserving men. Tall, well-dressed, handsome in the way that confidence often appeared as handsomeness. Smiling, charming, playing the role of visionary businessman with the ease of long practice. Grace moved through the crowd with her tray, listening, waiting for the right moment. Governor Harris stood near the fireplace, looking uncomfortable in his formal wear. He was a self-made man, a rancher who had turned to politics out of disgust with corruption. But politics had a way of making compromises seem necessary. He had taken Drummond's money, not bribes officially, campaign contributions, legal and documented and ethically questionable. Drummond moved to the front of the room, tapped a glass for attention. The orchestra fell silent. "Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for joining me tonight." His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who had given this speech 100 times in his mind and believed every word. Thunder Ridge represents the future of the Wyoming Territory. Under unified management, this district will yield $2 million in gold annually. We will build infrastructure, create jobs, bring prosperity to a region that has known only struggle. Applause, polite and expected. Grace set down her tray. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment where she either changed everything or destroyed herself. Trying. She walked toward the front of the room. People noticed, whispered. A servant out of place, moving with purpose toward the stage where Drummond stood. Security moved to intercept. 2 large men in suits, professional, efficient. Grace reached into her dress pocket, pulled out the first contract, held it up. "My name is Grace Holloway." Her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear, steady. "And I have proof that Clayton Drummond is a fraud, a thief, and a criminal." The room froze. The security men stopped uncertain. This was not a physical threat. This was theater. And they had not been trained for theater. Drummond's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. "What is this security remove this woman?" "These are your contracts, Mr. Drummond." Grace walked forward, placed the contract on a table where everyone could see. Loans to desperate families at 40% interest, terms designed to be impossible to meet, property seized when people defaulted, sold to shell companies you own. She pulled out more contracts, laid them out like cards in a poker game her father would have recognized. The Garza family, the Patterson Ranch, the Mueller homestead, 47 families, all the same pattern, all victims of fraud. Governor Harris stepped forward, picked up one of the contracts, began to read. "This is slander." Drummond's composure cracked. "These documents are stolen. This woman broke into my office." "Because you've been using the law to hide your crimes," Grace shot back. "You bribe the magistrate. You pay the sheriff. You own the newspaper. So yes, I stole them, because it was the only way to get the truth out." The crowd murmured, shocked, fascinated. Important people loved scandals as long as they were not implicated. "I have witnesses," Grace continued, "people willing to testify." The ballroom doors opened. Sam Keller walked in, still in his mining clothes, tracked mud on imported carpets, and did not care. "I'm one of them," Sam said. "Name's Samuel Keller. I run the miners' union. Drummond threatened to cut our water supply unless a good man surrendered his land. He destroyed a dam to make it look like that man's fault, then sued him for damages." Ida Carpenter entered next, old, dignified, carrying the weight of 68 hard years and radiating the moral authority of someone who had survived worse than Clayton Drummond could imagine. "I witnessed families destroyed," Ida said, "children going hungry because this man called loans due early and took everything." Reverend Cole came through a side door. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. A black minister in a room full of white wealth, a reminder of moral frameworks that money could not buy. "I have documented testimony from 37 families," Cole said, "notarized and witnessed, all confirming a pattern of predatory lending and property theft. The door opened again. Frank Holloway stumbled in, sober, for possibly the first time in years. His face was gray. His hands shook. But he walked to the front of the room and faced his daughter. "I'm one of them, too," Frank said. His voice was small, ashamed. "Drummond loaned me money knowing I couldn't pay. Then he made me sell my daughter to clear part of the debt, told me it was her only value." The room went silent, the kind of silence that follows revelations too ugly to ignore. Drummond's mask finally shattered. "You people are nothing," the words came out venomous, desperate. "You're dirt farmers and hole diggers, drunks and whores, and you think a few stolen papers can touch me. I have lawyers in New York. I have connections in Washington. I'll bury every last one of you." "Mr. Drummond," Governor Harris's voice cut through the outburst, cold, official. "These are serious allegations." "You wouldn't even be governor without my donations," Drummond snarled. The pretense of civility gone, the naked truth of power and corruption laid bare. The governor's face went hard. "Careful, sir. You're confessing to bribery in front of witnesses." The ballroom door flew open one more time. Owen Drummond stood there, soaking wet from the rain, holding a leather-bound ledger. His face was pale but determined. "He's right, Governor." Owen walked to the center of the room. "My father's been bribing you, and the magistrate, and the sheriff, and a dozen others. It's all in here." He placed the ledger on the table, opened it to a page marked with ribbon, columns of numbers, names, dates, payments. "Owen," Clayton's voice was strangled. "What are you doing? Something you never taught me, Father." Owen looked at his father with eyes that held equal parts love and hatred. The right thing. "You ungrateful. I gave you everything. You gave me your name. You never gave me your love, and I'm done trying to earn it." Clayton Drummond pulled a pistol from inside his jacket. Small, easily concealed. The kind of weapon important men carried when they wanted to feel powerful. He pointed it at Owen. "You betrayed me," Clayton said. His hand shook. His face was red. Everything he had built was collapsing, and his own son had lit the fuse. The crack of a rifle shot. The pistol flew from Clayton's hand. The bullet from Joe's rifle, fired from across the street through an open window, had struck with surgical precision, disarming without killing. The shot of someone who had spent years in war, learning exactly where bullets needed to go. Joe appeared in the doorway, rifle smoking, eyes cold. "Drop it, Drummond." Drummond's security moved, reached for weapons, prepared to escalate this into a bloodbath. 20 miners poured through the doors, armed with picks and shovels and a few rifles, outnumbering, outmuscling, making it clear that violence would not end well for anyone. "Everyone stand down," Governor Harris's voice was sharp, commanding. "This is not the Wild West." Sheriff Wade Garrett appeared from the back of the room. Grace had not seen him enter, had not known he was there. He looked at the scene, at Drummond surrounded, at the evidence laid out, at the choice before him. Grace watched his face, saw the calculation, the fear, the awareness that this was the moment where he decided what kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. Wade drew his pistol, pointed it at Hack Wilson and the other enforcers. "Drop your weapons," Wade said quietly, "or I arrest you for attempted murder of the governor's guests." Hack stared at the sheriff, at the betrayal. "You're on Drummond's payroll," was Wade corrected. "Past tense. I've looked the other way too long. Not tonight." The enforcers dropped their weapons. Clayton Drummond stood alone, surrounded by evidence and enemies and the ruins of an empire built on other people's suffering. "You can't do this," he said to the governor. "I own this territory." "You owned it," Governor Harris corrected. "Past tense. Mr. Drummond, you're under arrest pending investigation. If these allegations prove true, you'll face trial in Cheyenne." 2 of the governor's personal guardsmen, who had been standing quiet in the shadows, stepped forward with iron shackles. As they led Drummond past the table where Grace stood, he stopped, looked at her, at the scar on her face, at the woman who had brought down his kingdom. "You're still the ugly girl nobody wanted," he said, vicious to the end. Grace looked him in the eye, did not flinch, did not hide. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm the ugly girl who just took everything from you. Your reputation, your power, your son, and you're the man in silk who's going to rot in a federal prison. So I'd say we're both living with our scars tonight, Mr. Drummond. Only difference is I know how to carry mine." Drummond had no response. They led him away. The ballroom erupted, people talking, arguing, railroad executives making hasty exits, the governor already drafting official statements, the carefully constructed event dissolving into chaos. Grace stood in the center of it and felt her knees go weak. Joe was there instantly, caught her, held her up. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. They kissed. In the middle of Drummond's ballroom, in front of governors and criminals and witnesses to history, Grace Holloway and Josiah Brennan, two people who had been told they were worthless, proving through action that worth was something you claimed, not something others granted. 3 months later, the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne delivered its verdict. Clayton Drummond guilty on 15 counts of fraud, 7 counts of bribery, 3 counts of extortion, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, properties returned to rightful owners, contracts voided, restitution ordered, the miners' claims were restored, the water rights returned to public control. Thunder Ridge Mining District established a cooperative system where workers had ownership stakes in what they produced. It was not perfect. It was not paradise, but it was better. Grace stood on the courthouse steps beside Joe and watched justice happen. Real justice, the kind that changed lives rather than just punishing crimes. Frank Holloway attended the trial, testified against Drummond, then went home to die. Grace visited him in his last weeks, sat beside a bed in a rented room, and watched her father waste away from a liver that had finally given up processing poison. "I don't deserve forgiveness," Frank said one afternoon. His voice was weak. His eyes were clear for maybe the first time in Grace's memory. "No," Grace agreed. "You don't. Your mother would be proud of who you've become." Grace felt tears burn. "I wish she was here to see it." "She is," Frank whispered, "in every brave thing you do." He died 2 days later. Grace and Ruby buried him in the Thunder Ridge Cemetery. No grand funeral, no pretense that he had been more than he was, just 2 daughters laying a flawed man to rest, and choosing to remember the few good moments rather than dwelling on the many bad ones. Owen Drummond testified against his father, spent 3 days on the stand detailing years of crimes he had witnessed or participated in. The testimony destroyed any hope Clayton might have had for leniency. When it was over, Owen found Ruby outside the courthouse. "I'm leaving Thunder Ridge," he said, "starting over in Denver. Clean slate." "Will I see you again?" Ruby asked. Owen looked at her, at the young woman who had shown him that escape was possible. That legacy was not destiny. "If you want to, but only when I'm someone worthy of you." "You already are," Ruby said. "You just needed to see it." They parted, not with romance, not with promises, but with understanding. 2 people who had helped each other become better. That was enough. Ruby stayed in Thunder Ridge, opened a dressmaking shop, built a life that was hers alone. Grace watched her sister bloom into confidence and independence, and felt pride that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with witnessing someone become themselves. 6 weeks after the trial on the ridge overlooking the valley, Josiah Brennan asked Grace Holloway a question. They were sitting on the porch, 2 chairs, evening light turning the mountains gold, the creek running clear and controlled through channels Joe had rebuilt. The world at peace in the way it rarely was. Joe pulled an envelope from his pocket, handed it to Grace. She opened it. Inside was a deed to the land, the cabin, everything. Her name was on it, joint ownership with Joe's. "What's this?" she asked. "Deed to this land, half in your name." "Joe, I can't accept this." "You already earned it. You fought for it. You saved it. It's as much yours as mine." He took her hand. "I bought your freedom once," Joe said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. "I don't want to own you. I want to share my life with you, as equals, as partners, as—" Hell, I'm not good with words. "Grace Holloway, will you marry me?" Grace felt her heart expand until it seemed too large for her chest. All her life she had been told she was too damaged to be loved, too scarred to be wanted. The burned girl, the worthless one, the daughter no father could stand to look at. And here was a man who looked at her every day, who saw her scar and did not flinch, who saw her strength and did not feel diminished, who wanted to stand beside her, not above her. For 23 years, Grace said, people told me I was too broken to be loved, too scarred to be wanted. She touched her scar, the mark that had defined her life. You're the first person who looked at me and saw strength instead of damage. Because that's what's there. Yes, Grace said. I'll marry you, I'll build a life with you, and I'll spend every day choosing you. They were married on the ridge 3 weeks later. Reverend Cole officiated. Sam Keller stood as witness. Ida cried. Ruby smiled. 50 miners and their families came to celebrate. Grace wore a simple blue dress, practical, beautiful, sewn by her sister's hands. Their vows were simple. I vow to never own you, only honor you, Joe said. To stand beside you, never above you. To earn your trust every day for the rest of our lives. I vow to choose you every morning, Grace said. To fight beside you, not behind you. And to love you not despite my scars, but including them. They kissed as the sun set over mountains that had witnessed 1,000 human stories and would witness 1,000 more. But in that moment, this was the only story that mattered. 5 years passed. The Holloway Brennan Ranch grew. What had been a simple cabin became a compound, a medical clinic where Joe treated injuries and illnesses for anyone who needed it payment optional. A schoolhouse where Grace taught reading and arithmetic to miners' children. Ruby's cottage where she lived and worked, turning fabric into dignity for women who deserved to feel beautiful. Grace stood in the schoolhouse one afternoon teaching 12 children the alphabet. A small boy, no more than 6, traced the scar on her face with innocent curiosity. "Does it hurt, Mrs. Brennan?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Not anymore, sweetheart. It just reminds me I'm stronger than I thought." The child nodded, satisfied, and went back to his letters. Outside, Joe worked in the clinic. A miner sat on the examination table, arm in a makeshift splint. "Broken clean through," Joe said, probing gently. "You'll be in a cast for 6 weeks. But Sam's union negotiated sick pay now, so you'll get through it." The miner nodded, grateful. "Thank you, Doc. Thank your union. They're the ones who fought for the benefits." Thunder Ridge thrived in the way communities thrive when power is shared rather than hoarded. The mines operated safely. Workers had ownership stakes. Children went to school instead of into the shafts. It was not perfect. There were still accidents, still hardship, still struggle. Sam Keller, now mayor, worked with Sheriff Wade, who had been appointed territorial judge after proving his integrity during the Drummond trial. Ida Carpenter ran a boarding house that became the heart of the community, feeding families and spreading news with the efficiency she had once used to gather intelligence. But there was also hope. That evening, Grace and Joe sat on their porch. 2 children played in the yard nearby, a boy of 5 with Joe's dark hair, a girl of 3 with Grace's brown eyes and her father's smile. "Mama, Papa, can we stay up to see the stars?" the boy called. Grace looked at Joe. He looked back. They smiled the smile of parents who knew that childhood was short and stars were eternal. "Yes," Grace called back. "Let's watch them together." As darkness fell, the family of 4 sat on a bench that had replaced the 2 chairs. Below them, Thunder Ridge glowed with lamplight. Houses, families, lives being lived with dignity and hope. Grace leaned against Joe's shoulder, felt his arm around her, felt their children's warmth pressed against them. Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Paying $350 for a stranger, best investment I ever made. Even with all the trouble, especially because of the trouble. You didn't just change my life, Grace. You changed this whole valley. We changed it, together." Their son looked up. "Mama, why do you have that mark on your face?" The question came with childish directness. No malice, just curiosity. Grace touched her scar. "This is from a fire when I was little. It hurt a lot at the time, but it healed, and now it's just part of who I am. Does it make you sad?" "No, sweetheart. It makes me remember that I survived something hard, and surviving makes you strong." The boy considered this, then nodded and returned his attention to the emerging stars. Grace closed her eyes, let herself feel this moment completely. The warmth of family, the security of home, the knowledge that she had built something real and good from the ashes of a broken childhood. She had been bought for $350 in a cattle auction, had been told her entire life that her scar made her worthless, that no man would want her, that her only value was in what she could do for others. But she had learned something that no one had taught her. Worth was not something others assigned. It was something you claimed. She was Grace Brennan, teacher, fighter, mother, wife, partner. She was scarred, she was loved, she was free, and she had chosen every bit of it herself. Above them, stars wheeled through the infinite dark. Below them, a community built on justice rather than exploitation continued its slow work of becoming better. And on the ridge between heaven and earth, a family sat together and watched the night arrive with all its promise and peace. Some stories start with once upon a time. Grace's had started with fire and pain and a father who sold her like livestock. But it ended with stars and children and love freely given. It ended with iron. The end.